Okay, so today's lesson is going to take us back in time. So we're going to be learning about the regions in the early 1800s. So our standard for today is the regions which became known as the North, South, and West of the United States developed in the early 1800s, largely based on their physical environments and economies. So before we begin our reading, we first need to consider what information we already know. We can use the reading strategy, brainstorm and categorize to do this. Brainstorm means we're thinking about our ideas, while categorize means putting our ideas into groups. I'm teaching you the strategy because it will help you to see that if you organize information in a meaningful way, the information is easier to understand and remember. Brainstorming at the beginning helps to activate your prior knowledge and build on that background knowledge to extend your learning. So today we will use this strategy to help you learn and read about how to create a list of 10 states, organizing them into specific regions. So how many of you have been to another state or know any states? Great. So I will give you an example. So I have visited the state of Georgia. So on the left-hand side, I'm going to write Georgia. Take a minute and brainstorm some ideas on your paper. We're going to use these ideas to create a list. So take a few
Brainstorm
minutes.
some ideas of states?
Yes.
I think that's a state. New Mexico is a state.
Yep, those are some good ideas. Okay, let's come back together. Now that we've brainstormed some ideas about the things that we know, we can complete our brainstorm section. So, does anyone want to share some of their states?
Want
What
to
they
hear a
were
whole
able to come
bunch?
up
I know a whole bunch.
Yep, go ahead.
Well, you already have Georgia. North Carolina.
Okay, North Carolina.
Virginia.
Virginia.
Wyoming.
Wyoming.
Colorado.
Colorado.
New Mexico.
New Mexico.
Nevada.
Nevada.
Maine.
Maine.
New York.
New York.
And where we live, Ohio.
Ohio. Great, exactly. So now that we brainstormed our ideas, we've completed the brainstorm section. Now it's time to categorize them. Remember, categorize means to put things in groups. So let's look at our ideas on the board. What is a good way to categorize them? Since this is our first time categorizing, I'll give you a little hint. What do you notice about these ideas? Are some of these states in the same region on the map? You can look at the map up here, and the map's also in your book. What do you see? What do you notice about these ideas? Are some of them in the same area, or what do you think?
They're in different areas. They're all over. Some
Yeah.
are in different regions.
Right, exactly. So what he means by regions is the areas that the states are placed within the map. So he said they're in different areas. So we can describe these states as being in different regions. So on the map, I have drawn out the different regions that were established in the 1800s. They're a little bit different now, but we had them divided on the map like this. So what we are going to do is,
What if we start with Georgia, the one that you wrote first? Where would we put Georgia?
yeah, so Georgia is on, if you look at the map, Georgia's on the far right side. So I know, if you want to highlight on your maps where Georgia is, you can. So I'm going to create a category for Georgia because I know that it's on the far right side of the map, and I know that this is does anyone know?
Yeah, it's in the south.
It's in the south. Right, exactly. So I'm going to create the category South, and underneath it, I'm going to write Georgia. So take a few minutes and see what other categories you can come up with. Place each state under different categories. So we already have one category of South. there should be possibly a few more. So take a minute and place some of your states in different categories. I'll give you a few minutes.
We have regions like the West, right? That's another region.
What state would be in the West?
Like Wyoming is in the West.
Right, exactly.
And New Mexico.
Yep, exactly. Good. So let's come back after everyone looked like they were finished. Let's come back and share our ideas on the board. So how should we categorize all of this information? We already have South. One. What is another way that we can categorize some of this information?
The other area is North.
North. Any other ideas?
Yeah, out West.
West. So these are our three categories: South, North, and West. So let's start with our first state. Which category do you think? Well, we already did Georgia, so we can cross Georgia off. But let's start with North Carolina. Which category does North Carolina go to?
Well, even though it says North Carolina is in the South.
Right. So the South is down here. So we labeled this. This was the South. This was the North. And this was the West. And you said that North Carolina, which is right here, is in the South.
Yep.
Abbreviated North Carolina. Okay, what about Virginia?
Virginia's in the South too.
Virginia is also in the South. I'm just abbreviating. Virginia is up here. Right. What about Wyoming? Wyoming is up here.
That's in the West.
The West. Right, exactly. Colorado.
Colorado's in the West too. It looks like a square.
It does. Let's do Maine. Where do we think Maine is?
I know. Maine is way up north.
Maine is
almost
way
like
up north.
Canada.
Maine is all the way up here.
It's cold up there.
Right, exactly. What about New York?
New York
Where is New York?
is in the north.
New York is in the north. Right, exactly. What about New Mexico?
Is in the west.
New Mexico is in the west. And Nevada?
Nevada's out west too.
Nevada is
hot
also
there.
out west. And lastly is Ohio. Where is Ohio?
Right there.
Which category?
Up north.
Up north. We live in Ohio. Great job. So here we can see our brainstorming, our list of our ideas, and then here we can see how we categorize our information. So do you see how we categorize them?
Yeah, when we put them into their different regions.
Right, exactly. So long ago in the 1800s, this is how the states were positioned on a map. So we had the West, the North, and the South. And we talked about the different states that were in the West and the South. And the North, the South had Georgia, North had Maine and Ohio, the West had Colorado and Nevada and New Mexico. So do you think this is an easier way to really look at the states? Do you think it's easier if we would have to go through each one and look at Georgia, find it on the map, figure out which region it's in, or do you think it's easier to categorize them all together?
It's easier to categorize them because then you kind of see them in lumps and you see that those are all the ones that are in the same region. And it's easier to remember that way because when you just list them, then we're going all over the place.
Right, exactly. So thumbs up if you think that this is an easier way to understand rather than a long list of states. Right, exactly. So now we know that the different regions that make up the U.S. and we'll be able to better understand the chapter that we're about to get into. So during our reading, we'll actually have a better understanding, and we can use our charts to help us categorize other information mentioned in the text, like the characteristics in each region or any other information that we find out. So now that we have assessed our background knowledge, we can begin our reading of chapter 6.1. So if you want to turn the page, chapter 6.1.
Oh, geez, Miss Langa, this looks really long and confusing. There's so many new vocabulary words in here.
So this chapter is a little bit longer than others and is very complex. So I'm going to teach you a new reading strategy called read, pause, retell, reread to help you better understand complex passages. I'm teaching you this strategy because it will provide you with a technique that will help you to self-monitor your comprehension and help with recall. This will also help you think about what you have read in order to better understand this information. So this is a really good strategy to use during the reading while we're reading a text, because it will not only make the reading much easier, but you will be able to remember what you read. So today we're going to use this strategy to help you read and learn about how to effectively read 3 passages on your own, explaining your understanding of what you read. So before we read the chapter, I'm going to read you the introduction. So as we discussed earlier, this section focuses on the regions in the early 1800s. So we can read the first, if you make sure you're on the right page in your book. In the early 1800s, the United States had 3 regions that developed based on the physical environment of the era and the economy. The United States had boundaries that went from the Atlantic Ocean on the east coast to the Mississippi River on the west coast. The northern boundaries were the Great Lakes and what is now Canada. The southern border of the United States was Florida. In the early 1800s, Florida was not part of the United States and was part of the Spanish territory. So, let's move to the first section of the text. This is what we will be reading today. Now, don't let its length scare you. I'm going to model how to use this strategy for you. So I'm going to put up the new strategy on the board. Like I said, it's called read, pause, retell, and reread. So this is the strategy that we're going to be using. Okay, so the first step is to read aloud. Then we will pause, think about the reading. The third step, we will retell without looking. We're going to retell what we remember. Then we're going to reread. You will read it aloud, and then you will read it silently. And then finally, you will have your final explanation of what you read, which is your retell. So I'm going to do an example for you, and you can follow along with me on the board. So we are on the first passage. So first I will start the passage that I am reading. As the colonists started the move west past the Appalachian Mountains, the western region of the United States was growing in population. The western region, which went to the Mississippi River, consisted of farms and rural areas. There were growing cities and towns as the population in the new states increased. So, I read it. Now, I'm going to pause and think about the reading. So, now that I'm thinking about it, I didn't really understand it after only reading it once. It was kind of confusing, and I don't know, I didn't really understand it. So now I'm going to, without looking, I am going to give a recap of what I remember from the reading. So I know it talked about the western region and how it kind of consisted of farms, and that's really all I got from it. So now we've done the read, the pause, and the retell without looking. Now I'm going to reread it aloud and then silently. As the colonists started to move west past the Appalachian Mountains, the western region of the United States was growing in population. The western region, which went to the Mississippi River, consisted of farms and rural areas. There were growing cities and towns as the population in the new states increased. Now I'm going to read it silently. Okay, so now that I have reread it aloud and then silently, I am going to do my final explanation of what I really understood from the reading, my takeaway from it. So this is my retell. So from the reading, I really understood that the western region was kind of growing in cities and towns, and it was consisting of more farms and rural areas. So that was my retell. So now that I have really read it 3 times, I was able to give one last retell to really show my understanding of the reading. So by rereading the passage, I feel like I really did remember a lot more. Sometimes you really do have to read a difficult passage 3 times to retain all the details, and this is okay. Sometimes you do need to reread as many times as you need to. So now it's going to be your turn. So you're going to be reading some of the passages that are highlighted in your book, and I'm going to be walking around, and during that time you will be reading 3 passages from the section on your own. As you read, use the strategy read, pause, retell, and reread to better comprehend each passage. I'm going to be listening in on your reading, asking you to explain your understanding of each passage. It's very important to understand the information for our next activity. If you need help, you can refer back to the chart. You will be reading your passage first, thinking about the reading, pausing, thinking about the reading, then retelling without looking, reading it aloud, and then silently to do your final explanation of your retell. So go ahead, you may begin. I'll give you some time, and I'm going to be starting to walk around and kind of listen to how you are reading and how you're using the strategy. Want to read for me?
Should I read this one?
Yep, go ahead.
The northern region of the United States consisted of large cities and towns. There was a lot of industry and manufacturing in the north.
Right. Okay, so you did the read aloud. Now we're on the pause. Think about your reading. Did you understand it when you read it? Were you a little confused? How do you feel about how
I understood some of it, I think.
you understood some of it? Okay. So can you retell me without looking? Tell me what you read.
That there's lots of businesses up in the north.
There's lots of businesses up in the north. Okay, great. So now you're going to reread it to me aloud.
Okay. The northern region of the United States consisted of large cities and towns, and there was a lot of industry and manufacturing in the north.
Great. So now you're going to reread it to yourself silently.
Okay.
So now, can you tell me what this passage was about? This is the retell, your final explanation.
Okay. It's about that up in the north there were lots of large cities and towns, and that there was lots of businesses and manufacturing and industry up there.
Great, exactly.
Is that right?
Yep, exactly. You want to do the next passage?
The next passage says, the southern region of the United States consisted of many plantations and farms. It was very rural and did not have many cities and towns.
Great, exactly. So we did the read aloud. Now, how did you feel about your reading? Thinking about your reading, did you understand it the first time? Do you think you need to reread it again?
I think I remember some of it.
Maybe some of it. So do you think that you could, without looking, retell me what you remember?
Yeah, that in the south there's lots of plants and stuff.
Okay, great. So now we are going to reread. Can you reread it aloud to me, please?
The southern region of the United States consisted of many plantations and farms. It was very rural and did not have many towns and cities.
Great, exactly. So now read it silently to yourself. Okay, and then do you think that you could retell what you read?
Yeah, in the South there were a lot of plantations and farms, and it was very rural, and there weren't very many cities and towns.
Great, exactly. Okay, so let's come back together. You guys did a really good job of using this strategy. So do you see how really rereading and retelling helps you to better understand what you read?
Yeah, I used to hate to read stuff like this. I thought that it would take too much time to stop and retell and all that, but now I understand that sometimes you need to stop and think about what you read or what you've read before you move on to the next part. So if you didn't understand it the first time, you should go back and read it again and think about it and retell it, and then after you do it, once or twice, then you remember it, and it's easier to go on to the next part.
Right, exactly. So now you can really use this strategy to effectively comprehend the reading, understanding new material. And this is a really important skill to have, and you guys did a really, really great job.
Thanks.
So now, since we finished our reading on the regions in the early 1800s, you guys did a really good job of the reading and comprehending each section about the North, the South, and the West. However, there were a lot of words in the section, don't you think?
Yeah, there were.
To understand it, we really had to read it word for word. Do you think that you could remember all of those words?
Probably if I took a long time, I might remember all of them.
Yeah, if you took a long time, maybe you could remember them. Exactly. But do you think that there's an easier way to represent information that we read?
Yeah, there is. I remember we did this before, like when you draw pictures of stuff to help you remember things. Like the other day when we drew pictures of the timeline to show that how we've aged over the years. And we used pictures on a timeline for another lesson one time too, didn't we?
Yeah, exactly. So...
Oh, and you know what else? In books, they use pictures to help tell the story so that you see the picture and then you remember.
Right, exactly. So this can be a really great activity and can go into what we're going to do today. So I'm going to teach you a new reading strategy to really help you remember information in an easier way. So it's called visualizing. Visualizing can help to recall and picture information. I'm teaching you this strategy because it will show you how to use visuals to represent information from a text in a meaningful way that makes it easier to understand and remember. Today we will use this strategy to help you read and learn about how to use pictures to create a storyboard for the three regions which became known as the North, South, and West of the United States, developed in the 1800s. So in a book, pictures can be used to tell a story without words. Today we're going to use pictures to tell a story about and explain the West, the North, and the South. So you're going to create a storyboard of 3 pictures for each region. So a storyboard is a way to represent information visually using pictures. It looks like a comic strip. So let's try one together. Remember, this is going to help you visually tell the story of each region through pictures. So this strategy, remember, is called visualizing. So, like I said, it looks like a comic strip. So, for this chapter, we talked a lot about the physical environment and the economy of each region. So I need to make sure that these pictures really represent this information. So, I first need to choose a region. So, let's do the West. So from the reading, I remember that in the 1800s, Ohio was a western frontier, home to small but growing towns. So, in my first picture, I'm going to draw a small house, maybe with some land around it or some other houses being built. So, there's my house. There's land, and there's land in the background. Maybe other people are building houses. for my second scene on my storyboard, I remembered that they had good farmland that was cheap. So I'm gonna draw, maybe I'll draw like a farmer with his hat, and he's planting things and crops. So for my third and my final scene, I'm going to draw the natural resources that they used in the West, which were rocks and timber. These were very valuable during the time. So they had their natural resources like rocks and timber that they used. So now my storyboard is complete. So it tells a story from beginning to end of how Ohio was a western frontier, home to small but growing towns. So I drew a small house with some land around it and some other houses. And for my second scene, I drew the farmland and how it was actually very cheap. So there's the farmer. And then my last scene is the natural resources that they had in the West, like rocks and timber. So now I was able to create a visual story. I was able to tell my story of the West through the use of pictures. So now it's your turn. So I'm going to give you some time to work. Remember, each region needs its own storyboard. The focus for this activity is to visualize information from the text. Your book is a really good resource to use for information. Once you finish, turn and talk with your classmates about your storyboards.
So we're supposed to draw 3 pictures for each one?
Yeah, so you are going to create kind of like, do you know what a comic strip looks like?
Yeah, like
So-
Charlie Brown?
Yeah, so it's using pictures to tell the story. So in mine, you can kind of picture it like it's like framed,
Okay.
like in threes. So creating 3 pictures of,
Kind of like what I'm doing here?
yeah, exactly. So mine was the West. So you can start by labeling it, and then even if you want to look through, let's see, in your packet, let's see, you're working on the North first. So in the packet it says Ohio was considered part of the West during this time. Here's the developments of the North. So the North had large cities, small cities, and towns, rocky and thin soil, trade centers, manufacturing centers such as shipping, logging, and factories, ironworks, textiles, and cottage industries. So what do you think, using that information, when I say large, small cities and towns, what comes to mind when you visualize that?
Like a little village where there's houses real close and a couple of stores and a street.
Right, exactly.
So that's what I was drawing here. Does that look like houses and a street and whatever?
Exactly. So like with mine, in the West, they kind of talked about having small but growing towns. So when I thought of small but growing towns, I was able to really visualize, maybe like one big house that was like the main or the first house, and
Then some other new houses being built too?
Yes.
Okay. And so when you did the farm, I liked how you put the hat on the farmer. That was cool.
Yeah, exactly. So then for the second part, I see that.
So I drew a ship because it said that in the north they had shipbuilding. So does that look like a ship?
Yes. Good.
And it's on the water.
Yep.
And then for the last part, I made a factory with smoke coming out of the chimneys.
Yeah.
Because they had factories with iron and
Right.
textiles and
Right.
things.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's great. So keep working. I'm gonna go and work it with a couple other students.
Should I work on another one then?
Yeah. Keep working.
Okay.
Yep. That was great. So I'm really liking the ideas that I'm seeing, that everyone is kind of able to visualize what they're seeing. So let's come back together and let's share our storyboard. So we shared mine already for the West.
Do you want to see mine from the north?
Yes. So we will just cover up mine. So go ahead and you can explain your storyboard.
Okay, well, in the northern part of the United States, we have larger cities and small towns and small cities, and there's trade, and so there's ships and shipbuilding, so they make ships, and there's up north there's factories where they make stuff out of iron and
Right.
textiles, which is like cloth and stuff, I think.
Exactly.
And there are factories where the goods were made up north.
Right. So can anyone tell me, when they look at this picture, when we use this strategy so that in order to remember this information, we can really mentally picture it and visualize it. It's not something that's just going to go away. Like when we read words, we forget about them. They go away easily. But now we can visualize it. So when you think of the North and you see this picture, what do you think of? What do you
When I
think
see that
of?
first picture,
Yes, this
I think of a
first
city
picture.
or a town, a medium-sized town or a small city, or even maybe the beginning of a big city.
Great. And what about the second picture? When you think of the West, or the North, I'm sorry, and you see this picture, what idea does that bring up from the text?
They made ships up there because there's lots of water up north.
Right, exactly. And what about the last picture?
The last one is a factory because they had a lot of industry in the north where they made things with iron and all the different goods and stuff that they produced up north.
Great, exactly. So does anyone want to share another storyboard?
Yeah, I have one more.
Okay.
I did the south. It was hard to draw pictures for some of them, but I think I'm going to remember them.
That's the whole point. As long as you can visualize them.
So this way, not only do I have some words in my head, but I have pictures in my head, so I can get to the information from like two different ways.
Right, exactly. So that whenever you think of the West, the North, and the South, you're not thinking, oh, I don't remember anything, there was a lot of words. You're really remembering, oh, I remember that this was associated with the South. So go ahead and you can explain your picture.
Okay, so for the south, south is very rural, so that means that there's like lots of farms and there's not many cities and towns. There's plantations, which are like big farms. The farming economy was real big. The first picture is kind of hard to draw because I was trying to draw cotton, and they're picking cotton and putting cotton in baskets.
Right, so when you remember their work, you're going to remember your picture and remember, oh, cotton, they were growing and picking cotton.
Yep.
Right.
And then other types of plantations down there. That's like tobacco, because they grew a lot of tobacco because they didn't know that smoking was so bad, I don't think, back then.
Right.
But they had a lot of tobacco and cotton, and then because it was so sunny there and hot and whatever, they could grow plants for like a really long time. They had a long
Right.
growing season
Exactly.
in the South.
And I like that you even made that connection from the text. You got that little detail in there, and you showed that it was really hot, and they were able to grow multiple different things, and you really used the text to create that and
Yep.
remember that.
Could you tell it's really hot because the sun's rays are kind of going like this?
Yes.
Yeah.
I like that, yeah.
And then
Your last one?
the last one, I kind of didn't know how to draw this because it's talking about like marshy coastal plains. So I think that kind of means like there's a little bit of swampiness some areas. But I remember in the reading that they even like grow rice in certain parts down there where it's real marshy and swampy. So those are people splashing in the water by the marsh, and they're picking the
Picking
rice
the
off of the
rice.
plants that are growing in the water.
Great, exactly. So you guys did a really great job. So do you think that this was an easier way to understand information when you do it this way with pictures and visuals as opposed to reading it word for word?
Yeah, I think it's a lot easier with pictures. Pictures are awesome. It's easy to remember things when there's a picture, and the picture makes you remember the words even.
Right, exactly. So now, do you really see how these visuals help to represent information from a text in a more meaningful way? It really does make you remember and understand it, because when I think of the South, I think of what? When you think of the South, what do you picture?
Like all the plantations and the hot sun, and not a lot of big cities, and a lot of people working on the farms, growing tobacco and cotton, and working in the marshy areas.
What about the North?
And when I see the picture from the North, I remember that in the North they had cities, some big cities, some medium-sized cities with lots of buildings, and they made boats and ships up there, and they had industry up there.
Right, and in the West, they talked about the natural resources that they had, like timber and
stones and stuff, right?
Exactly. And they had farmers. And
I remember that's a farmer because he's wearing that cool hat.
Yeah, and farming was really cheap back then, so that's how I remember farming. And then their cities were small, but growing. Exactly. Right.
Yeah,
So
pictures help us tell the story of like the different regions of the West and the South and the North, just like the pictures in a book would do.
Right, exactly. So now, when we think about the regions in the early 1800s, instead of having to, flip through our entire book and really reread word for word, we can instead visualize our storyboards and the images that come to mind like we just discussed. So this is a much easier way to remember information instead of having to really memorize words from a text.
Right, so there are lots of things that we learned today, like you can categorize things to help you remember how things go together.
What did we start categorizing things with first?
We started categorizing the states into the different areas, like the South and the North and the West.
Right, exactly. So you were able to name specific states like Wyoming and Colorado, and you said that's in the upper left-hand part of the map, which is the west part. And then you said other states like New York, Maine were up north. And then what were some southern states?
Like Georgia and Virginia. Right.
So it really focused on
the different sections and regions of the country.
The sectionalism of the map, exactly, into the west, the north, and the south. And like you said, we categorize them like that. And then in our reading, do you remember what the skills were called that we used to really comprehend?
Yeah, we read it once, and then we tried to tell it without looking, and then we read it again out loud, and we read it silently.
Right.
And then we told the story again.
Exactly. So that was called read, pause, retell, and reread. So from brainstorming and then categorizing our information, we already knew that the text was going to talk about the different categories, the different sections that are the different that make up the map, the different regions of West, South, and North. So within the reading, it was a kind of complex, difficult reading, but you were able to take it, break it down passage by passage, and first read it. Then you really thought about the reading. Did I understand it? Should I read it again? And then you were able to, you told me what you remembered based on the reading. Retold it to me. And then you read it again aloud. So you first read it aloud, then you read it aloud again, and then you read it silently. So 3 times rereading it. And then, were you able to retell it?
Yeah, at the end, after you read it once and then thought about it and read it again and then read it silently, like, I think I remembered just about everything from it.
Right, so your comprehension really went up. You were able to really recall it.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then, lastly, to kind of bring all of it back together, we used,
Visualize,
exactly.
right?
So you were able to really picture the information, make mental images of it. And you said, you know, you thought of farming and the plantations
and the hot sun.
Right, so when you think about the different sections, the different regions of the West, the North, and the South, you're really able to think about and visualize the information. Instead of thinking of words, you think of pictures, make mental images. Right, exactly. So you guys did really good, and now you can identify the different regions, which became known as the North, the South, and the West of the United States that were developed in the early 1800s. So you guys did a great job using Categorize and Brainstorm, and read, pause, retell, and reread, and visualizing. And you can use these other skills within any other subject areas. So you guys did really, really good. Really, really good job today.
It's a great way to remember so much information.
Right, exactly. Good job.
Thank you.